Okay, welcome to lab number 11 on Node Manager. So in this lab, you're going to learn how to configure Node Manager, the Java version of it, and how to control startup and shutdown using Node Manager. So let's go ahead and start with configuring Node Manager. So go ahead and open up a terminal window. And the first thing you need to do is edit the node manager.properties file. Now, every time you create a WebLogic domain, you get an instance of a node manager. And for this lab, we're going to use the WebLogic server example domain that we've been working with. So go ahead and navigate to your domain root directory, and then to the WebLogic server domain home. And then under here is a node manager directory. So do a listing in here and take a look at what's actually in here. I've run this before already in preparation for this lab, so there are some files like log files and log files that if you haven't run Node Manager before, they won't be in this directory. So the ones to focus on are the node manager.domains. So go ahead and cat that file and take a look at it. That will contain the fully qualified path to this domain. This is created automatically using the configuration wizard. So prior to 12c, say WebLogic 11g, for instance, there was typically a single node manager configuration per server, per physical or virtual server, or host, whatever you want to call it. 12c introduced a node manager configuration per domain. But you can still have a node manager per host if you want. You don't need to have one per domain. So if you have multiple domains on a server, you don't necessarily need multiple node managers running. You could have one node manager per host to manage all your domains. I'm not sure why Oracle changed that, but either option is viable. It just depends on what requirements you may have in your environment. So let's go ahead and edit the node manager.properties file. This is where the bulk of your node manager configuration is going to occur. You can look up each one of these parameters online in the online documentation and describe in detail what these parameters do. Some of them are pretty obvious, like node manager home, Java home, which should already be filled in, start scripts, listen addresses, listen ports, and logging, and so on and so forth. So take a look at listen port. The default listen port for node manager is 5556. That's fine. Let's use the default port for this lab. And that's what I usually do in a production, in any environment anyway, unless I've got multiple node managers running. Then obviously I would want to change that. Secure listeners defaulted to true. So node manager can be configured to listen securely on a secure port. And so we certainly want that. We don't want any credentials that are used to connect to and start or shut down WebLogic servers going over the wire in plain text. So leave that as true. The one value that we do need to change, actually there's two values that we need to change. The listen address, which is localhost. We need to change that to the IP address of this machine. So go ahead and do that now. I'm going to put in my address. And this native versions enabled. Oracle has native libraries for certain operating systems like Oracle Enterprise Linux. And these native libraries improve performance of Node Manager. And usually they're tied around network or disk I/O. And so they're usually in the form of a C library. But we don't have one. I certainly don't have one for OS 10. WebLogic Oracle doesn't support OS 10 officially. So go ahead and change that to false. It'll be true by default. I've already changed it. So go ahead and change it to false. And save this file and quit. And that's it as far as Node Manager is concerned. So now go ahead and start Node Manager. To do that, go back up to your domain home directory. And in the bin directory, there's actually a start node manager shell script. And all you do is just run that script. And it starts up pretty quick. There's not much to it. So this is running as a separate JVM process. And you can see it spits out a copy of your properties file. And then what you're looking for is the secure socket listener started on port 5556. And the host should be the listen address that you defined in the property file. So Node Manager is running. So now what we have to do is create machines in our WebLogic domain. So go ahead and open up another terminal window and start your admin server. So while this is loading, a machine in WebLogic represents a physical or virtual host. So when we create a managed server within WebLogic, the only identification that it has is the IP address. The IP address doesn't necessarily tell us what server that machine is running on necessarily, what physical or virtual server that it's running on, because you could have a multi-home machine where there could be multiple IP addresses. As we saw when we didn't define a listen address for our servers, a WebLogic server instance can bind itself to any available listen address. So it's impossible for WebLogic to determine what IP addresses are associated with which machines. And so there's a concept within WebLogic of a machine, and it's a logical concept, but we can configure a machine and associate managed servers with it. And so WebLogic knows that a certain group of managed servers are on a particular machine. And it's through this machine configuration that we specify Node Manager. And it's through this machine configuration that we also configure Node Manager. So it's not enough to configure Node Manager from a runtime perspective. We also must tell the domain how to use Node Manager as well. So now that the admin server is up and running, go ahead and log in to the admin console. And remember, we're still accessing things over the domain-wide admin port. So go ahead and log into the console. To configure a machine, go over to the domain structure window here, and under environment, click on machines. Click new. And the table in the lab guide for this lab spells out the configuration parameters for this machine. So let's go ahead and you can use those values. So let's go ahead and name this machine A according to the lab guide. Click next. By the way, you can leave machine OS blank. You don't need to specify an operating system. So under type, the type of node manager that is running is SSL enabled. If you click this drop-down list, you can see that there's SSH, RSH. I'm not sure why this is in here, since it's very insecure and unprotected, and plain. So SSH and RSH are the shell script versions of Node Manager, and plain is the non-SSL version of the Java version of Node Manager, and then there's SSL, which is the default. So since our Node Manager instance is listening securely, go ahead and accept the default there for SSL. And on listen address, specify the address that you specified in the node manager.properties file. And then leave port the same, 5556, and click finish. Okay, so we've created our machine. Now you can see here that we didn't tie it to a physical or virtual machine necessarily. There's really no way for us to do that association. What we do is we associate managed servers with a machine. So it's a logical grouping in that sense. So click on machine A, and then click on the servers tab and hit add. And from here, we can actually select an existing server, which is what you would expect to see, but you can also create a new server and associate it with the machine. Go ahead and add MS1 and MS2. And unfortunately, you got to do these one at a time. Click add again and add MS2. And let's also add MS3 as well. Click finish. So you can see here on our servers tab for our machine A, we see that they're all associated, all of our managed servers are associated with machine A. Okay, so now what we need to do is we're not quite ready to start these servers up using Node Manager. In order to use Node Manager to start up an admin server, there are a few one-time setup steps that we need to perform. Specifically, we must generate startup information and startup properties for the admin server. So a Node Manager starts up the admin server. It doesn't necessarily use the start WebLogic shell script. It needs certain properties defined in separate property files. So what we need to do is we need to issue some commands using WebLogic scripting tool to generate these property files. So let's go back to our terminal window and let's open up a new window and let's go ahead and launch the WLST shell script. So if you recall, that shell script is located under Oracle Home, Oracle Common, bin, WLST.sh. Now, I really recommend putting this in your path. I'm too lazy, so I have to type the whole thing out every time. But at least you get to see where the script is located. Okay, so here's our prompt. In order to connect to the admin server, we issue the connect command. And if you recall, you can type help in WLST and pass it any WebLogic command, and it will give you the syntax for that command and an example of how to run that command. We need to specify the username, the password, and the URL to the admin server. So we're going to issue connect. Connect is WebLogic. WebLogic 123. So a word here on specifying usernames and passwords. As you can see, I'm entering this in a terminal window. It's visible to me. It's visible to you. You can see this. It's plain text. Really, in a production environment or even a staging environment or QA environment, you should be generating keys. You can use a key, which is encrypted, to connect to WebLogic. And that's what I would recommend in a production environment. But for the sake of the lab, we're just going to use username and password in plain text. So now go ahead and specify the secure URL to the admin server. And then 9001 is the port. Okay, go ahead and hit enter. Okay, this is what I wanted you to see. So recall that the admin server is now listening securely on port 9001. WebLogic scripting tool attempted to establish an SSL connection to that port. And this is a one-way SSL connection. So what happens is that when we connect to a server over one-way SSL, the server presents a certificate to the client. And the client attempts to validate that cert. And that's called establishing trust. In order to validate a cert, there needs to be a trust key store that contains a public key. So in most cases, to establish trust, there needs to be a trust key store with a public key that the client can use to validate the server certificate. So by default, unfortunately, WebLogic scripting tool is not configured for trust. We need to configure WLST with a trust store. And it's relatively simple. We actually just have to specify a single JVM argument. So go ahead and exit out of this. And we need to edit the WebLogic. We need to edit the WLST.sh script. So I'm just going to edit this using VI. And if you want, you can make a backup copy of it if you're concerned about fouling it up. So at the bottom of the file, there's a JVM arguments or JVM underscore args shell variable. And this is where we're going to put our JVM flag. So go to the end of this line and insert the JVM argument for specifying the trust key store. And the exact syntax is in the lab guide. So I'll type it out here. It's -D. And then the parameter and the JVM argument name is WebLogic.security.trust key store equals demo trust. So by modifying this file, we are specifying a trust key store for the entire server. So if I had multiple admin servers on this one particular host, we really only have one instance of WebLogic scripting tool. So WLST will use this demo trust key store every time that we launch it. I don't really recommend modifying this script. I recommend that you write your own script that simply sources the set WebLogic environment script. And you can use this script as a model, or you can simply just create a copy of it. But if you're using your own generated identity and trust, then the syntax here will be slightly different. It won't be demo trust. It'll be the location to your trust store. So go ahead and save this and exit.